Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again, and today we're going to be talking about a character that isn't talked all that much about, and that is Cormac Macart. Cormac Macart! A character created by Robert E. Howard, but Robert E. Howard didn't write much about this character. This character only appeared in 4 stories written by Robert E. Howard, and 2 of those stories were unfinished. Really good character, though, Cormac Macart, the renegade Irishman, the outlaw who joined a band of Vikings and became the right-hand man of Wulfhere, the Skull Splitter. Wulfhere, the Skull Splitter, the captain of this band of Vikings. He always carried around a great big axe. He had a bad temper. He liked to kill people. You know, everybody needs a hobby. And that was his. So Cormac Macart joined this band of Vikings. And him and Wulfhere became best pals. And they had some excellent adventures. 4 of them anyway. And like I said, 2 of those adventures were unfinished. And so this character, Cormac Macart, he has kind of an interesting history. So you had those 4 stories. Only one of those stories, the story The Temple of Abomination, which appears last in this book, only that story has a supernatural element. All the other stories in the series are straight adventure stories. And the Temple of Abomination, even though it shows up last in this volume, it was apparently the first story that he wrote about this character. And later he decided to start the series again, and he wrote straight adventure stories, probably with the idea of trying to break into the adventure pulps. But that did not happen, and the stories remained unpublished while Robert E. Howard was still alive. Years later, Robert E. Howard became very popular in the late 60s and the 1970s, and every scrap of anything that he ever wrote was being reprinted, including these stories, which was a good thing because these stories are really, really good. Now, originally, these were published in hardcover. This volume here is from the Robert E. Howard Library from Baen Books. Excellent series from Baen Books. This actually is the first volume of that series. And in the 1990s, this series of books, the Robert E. Howard Library, kind of kept Robert E. Howard's writing alive because not much else was being published at that time. And I remember being surprised that this was actually the first volume that was published in that series. Because like I said, he's not a particularly well-known character from Robert E. Howard, and he didn't write much about this character. And actually, there's a lot in this book that was not written by Robert E. Howard. A lot of this book was written by David Drake. But we'll get into that. The character was originally published in hardcover and then reprinted in paperback in a book titled Tigers of the Sea. Tigers of the Sea. And the stories in this book, like I said, 2 of them were unfinished. So they were finished. They were finished by the editor of this volume, who was Richard L. Tierney. He finished The Tigers of the Sea, and he finished the Temple of Abomination. The other 2 stories were finished. And the other 2 stories are Swords of the Northern Sea, which was really good. And probably my favorite of the Cormac Macart stories is a story called The Night of the Wolf. And The Night of the Wolf also appeared in some paperback editions of Bran MacMorn because it has pics in it. But like I said, Tigers of the Sea and Temple of Abomination were unfinished. And if they had been left unfinished, there probably wouldn't be enough to actually fill out a book, or at least it would be a really short book. As it is, this is a short book. It runs 200 pages, but they're not real big pages. And so it's a short volume, even though these two stories were finished. The endings were okay from Tierney. It's hard to write. It's hard to just pick up a story from Robert E. Howard and finish it. It always feels not like Robert E. Howard. You could usually tell when someone else finishes a Robert E. Howard story. And I think that is the case here. But this is a good volume, and this is a good collection of stories. Tigers of the Sea. And because Robert E. Howard was so popular, the publishers actually commissioned the writer Andrew Offutt to continue this series and write novels about this character, Cormac Macart. And Andrew Offutt actually wrote a lot more about this character than Robert E. Howard did. And you'll still find those pastiche novels floating around used bookstores now and again. Those novels, I haven't read them all. I think I read one, actually. I've read that David Drake actually helped Andrew Offutt on some of the plots for those novels. He says that himself in this volume. Now, this was the volume from the 1990s. Again, you have a case where you don't have many stories from Robert E. Howard for Cormac Macart. So this time, David Drake finished Tigers of the Sea. And so you have two different versions actually three different versions. You have Robert E. Howard's original version that was unfinished. Then you have Tierney's version from Tigers of the Sea. And in this volume, we have David Drake's version, where David Drake finishes that story. David Drake left Temple of Abomination the way it was. He didn't finish that one. But there is also a shorter version of Temple of Abomination that does have an ending. It was an outline, basically, a draft. And that is included in this volume as well. So you have two different versions of Temple of Abomination in here. And also in this particular volume from Baen Books, the first story in here is written by David Drake. So the first thing you read when you pick up this volume is not Robert E. Howard. The first thing you read is David Drake. And that story is really long. That is a story called The Land Towards Sunset. And Robert E. Howard doesn't start in this book until page 73 with Tigers of the Sea. So there's a lot of Drake in this particular volume. And I kind of think that was deliberate because David Drake was a popular writer in the 1990s. And in the 90s, he might have been more popular than Robert E. Howard. The 1990s were not a great period for Robert E. Howard. Conan stories were still being published, but not stories by Robert E. Howard. At that point, all the Robert E. Howard Conan stories were pretty much out of print for the most part. I don't think the Fantasy Masterworks edition of Conan came out until the early 2000s, although I could be wrong. But it was not the best time, the 1990s, for Howard. And so I was thrilled to see this book come out. This is a book with a lot of David Drake in it. And the first story in this volume that was written by Drake, The Land Towards Sunset, is a decent story. It's a good story. It doesn't read exactly like Howard, though. You can completely tell that this is a story by Drake and not Howard. And that kind of goes for the ending to Tigers of the Sea in here as well. Tigers of the Sea is a good story. And you can see why you'd want to end that story. You'd want to finish it off because you would want to know how that story ends. Because Robert E. Howard broke off at a point where you're like, what's the rest of the story? So it's nice to have an ending of that story, but it isn't Howard. But because there are so few Cormac Macart stories, I think that's one of the reasons that these stories did not end up being published in the Del Rey set of Robert E. Howard books, which is unfortunate. I think there certainly was room for one more Del Rey volume in the Del Rey series of books. They didn't publish Almeric, and they could have done it in a final volume, and they could have published these stories, because these stories are excellent and certainly deserve to be read. They're just a little bit hard to find now. You can find them, they're floating around, but there are a couple different versions of them. There's this one, there's Tigers of the Sea. Both good books. I kind of prefer David Drake's volume. I think he did a better version for the ending of Tigers of the Sea, for one thing. And I like that there are the two versions of the Temple of Abomination in here, which is not the greatest story in the world. But it is interesting because it is a supernatural story. It is a story with monsters in it. And that's kind of cool. David Drake's story is kind of science fiction-y, where Wolfhere and Cormac visit the last bit of Atlantis, a lost underwater colony of Atlantis. And so that's interesting. But the rest of the stories in here are straight adventure stories, and they're really, really good ones, and they should be read. We never learn too much about Cormac Macart as a character. We know he's an outlaw, and he's really bad at disguising himself when he tries to go back to Ireland and pretend he's not Cormac Macart. People usually are like, "Hey, you're Cormac Macart. Damn it." There's that. But we never really learned too much about this character, which is a shame. It would have been nice if Robert E. Howard had written more about this guy. But, he was too busy writing about Conan and Kull and Solomon Kane, so I can't really complain too much. So if you see this volume lying around, pick it up. It's excellent. These are excellent adventure stories. And one pretty good supernatural story from Robert E. Howard. If you see this volume lying around, pick it up. It's a decent edition of these stories. You just have to put up with Tigers of the Sea, I guess, being finished by other writers. At least the Robert E. Howard story, Tigers of the Sea, David Drake tells you where that story finishes in the introduction, so you know exactly where one story ends, where one writer ends, Robert E. Howard, and where David Drake picks up that story. And that's a nice thing that David Drake did. So, yeah, Cormac Macart, interesting character. Not much from him, but, very much well worth reading. We'll catch you next time.